Alberta Primetime with Michael Higgins.
Welcome to Alberta Primetime. Ahead tonight, our politics panel on the Premier's visit to Quebec. But first, funding tied to performance.
When we were in conversation with chartered surgical facilities, they're doing typical, say, a knee replacement. They can do 8 to 10 within a day. And yet in our hospitals, we were finding we were only doing roughly about 4 of the equivalent type of surgery.
The Alberta government this week rolling out what it calls patient-focused funding. Funding tied directly to the number and complexity of surgeries performed in hospitals. A model the Premier says will incentivize hospitals to do more with resources and improve transparency. And joining us now, Dr. Braden Mans, a professor of medicine and health economics at the University of Calgary. Dr. Mans, good to see you, sir. Welcome back.
Thanks for having me, Michael.
All right, so the implementation of patient-focused funding, how does this play as a solution for clearing surgical wait lists, getting Albertans to surgery quicker?
Well, the headline sounds pretty good, patient-focused funding, and that sort of makes sense. Right now, surgery funding for hospitals flows through a global budget. And what the government is doing is it's taking that money away from the global budget, and it will be giving it back to the hospitals as this patient-focused funding, or what we call activity-based funding, where the money is based on how much it actually costs to provide that service. And the goal is to do more surgeries. But of course, it gets a little more complicated than that.
Okay, so in terms of those complications, what is the impact then on the health system? Where does it leave quality of care?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, this government is really focused on access, and access is important to Albertans, frankly, to all Canadians. And we're not the only province that has done this. Quebec and Ontario have done this as well to different extents. But Quebec did this probably 15 years ago. And what we saw is that the surgeries that follow this patient-focused funding, the number of those surgeries go up, but the number of other surgeries don't go up. So that's one concern, that we're going to see more of these types of surgeries. And you can clearly see where this is going. All of the surgeries that are in this patient-focused funding formula are ones that are done in the chartered surgical facilities. So this will quickly move from a pilot and bolster access and volume in the chartered surgical facilities. Again, access is important, but what's left behind are all those cancer surgeries, the heart surgeries that can only be done in hospitals. And this is going to, again, negatively impact access for that. We can talk about quality for a long time, but right now we don't assess quality in the chartered surgical facilities. And we've actually really backed away from assessing quality of surgeries in the health system. Over the past 3 years, it's just moved to access and a focus on that.
How do you view comparative performance between surgeries in hospitals and chartered surgical facilities? Is there as much disparity as we heard in the clip of Minister LaGrange off the top?
Well, chartered surgical facilities, they're not backstopped by intensive care units or inpatient beds. So they're doing the easier surgeries, the ones that you can do surgeries in the chartered surgical facilities more quickly. They take the easier cases, those are quicker to do. They don't teach students, they don't teach our residents. We need to train our future physicians and operating room staff and all of that sort of stuff. So why do they take the easier cases? Well, those are the ones you can do safely in the community, but those are also the ones that are a lot more profitable. You get paid the same, essentially, for a case whether it takes you 2 hours or 3 hours. So which ones are the chartered surgical facilities going to want? They want the 2-hour cases. So what's left in the hospital system are the sicker patients who need more support, who are going to take longer because they might be a redo surgery. So it's pretty unfair to compare. It's not an apples to apples comparison.
Oh, okay, so then what are you watching for where the costing of surgeries is concerned under this new funding model, especially as that costing applies to hospitals?
Well, so the thing that just my eyes bugged out when I saw the cost for the surgeries, it's twice what the $8,500 for the hips and knees. It's twice what the health system cost for those same types of surgeries is. So I was scratching my head. Why have they come in with such a high price? But then what you realize is that patient-focused funding, so if it's they're saying it, let's just say it's $10,000 for a hip surgery, they're taking that $10,000 away from the hospital in the global budget, and they're giving it back to them in the if they do the surgery. So if hospitals don't keep up, don't do the volume they did last year, they're going to lose a lot of money. But that double the price now is what the price is going to be for the chartered surgical facilities. So I presume this is all meant to try to increase the number of surgeries that will be done in these chartered surgical facilities, and it's actually going to penalize the hospital. So, yeah, I was trying to understand why the prices were so high, but I think that's the justification, or that's the implication.
The Premier says, this is about reducing downtime, incentivizing the best use of resources. So with that in mind, what kind of pressure might this put on management at the local hospital level?
Because we have not done a good job in workforce planning, you need three things for a surgery. You need money, a budget that's allocated to you, you need the operating rooms, and you need the staff and the surgeons and the anesthetists. We barely have enough anesthetists and operating room staff. So, when a patient goes to a chartered surgical facility, they are taking their surgeon, their anesthetist, and the operating room team with them. Those people are not available in the public system. So what we've seen with more contracted out surgeries over the past 3 years is longer wait times for surgeries that can only be done in hospital. So we're not correcting that workforce challenge.
I'm sure you've heard this. Many of us have. You'll often hear from frustrated Albertans, the health system is broken. It's time to try something new. How do you respond to that perspective, even the willingness of Albertans to embrace privatization?
Yeah, listen, I think 90% of Canadians say that they're willing they're frustrated and they're willing to explore new solutions. The problem is when you implement solutions, and I'm actually not against activity-based funding, as long as we regulate it and we understand that it's going to do more of these types of surgeries, and that that's what Albertans want. They want joint surgeries. They don't want as many cancer surgeries. These things just have implications, and we have to understand that. So I'm not against necessarily us trying this, as long as we regulate it carefully. The problem is when we implement things, it's going to have unintended consequences. What we really need for the system is a long-term plan, not a plan that's a 2-year plan between electoral cycles. We need accountability in the system. We need more partnerships with doctors. So there are solutions. It's just that sometimes the ones that are easy to announce, they sound great. That's not the fix for our systems.
All right. We'll leave it there for time. As always, appreciate your time, Dr. Mans. Thank you, sir.
Thanks for having me.
That's Dr. Braden Mans, a professor of medicine and health economics at the University of Calgary. From the push for closer ties with Quebec to renewed calls for stronger privacy laws in the wake of the voters list data breach. Time now for tonight's politics panel. And joining us this evening, Kathy Kerr, freelance writer and editor, longtime Alberta print journalist, and Chris Spearman, former mayor of Lethbridge. Good evening to you both. And let's begin with the Premier pitching Quebec on cooperation and partnership.
How to assert provincial autonomy, which has been important to Quebec, is important to our province. We often get a lot of wisdom from some of the legislation going through the Quebec legislature, which I'm watching with great interest. But I think that the main thing is looking at ways that we can renew our partnership.
Danielle Smith and Quebec Premier Christine Frechette ahead of discussions on making interprovincial trade simpler, partnering in manufacturing, tech, agriculture, and of course collaboration on an east-west energy corridor. Kathy, how much of a relationship expansion do you actually see building between the two provinces?
Well, I think obviously there's two factors that are happening here. And the first one is that question about an energy corridor. And it appears that the current government of Quebec is not completely averse to that. They have some interest actually in developing some of their own natural gas, I gather now. So I think that there's some common cause there. It probably brings them a little closer on that, since previous governments have been pretty adamantly, Quebec government's been pretty adamantly anti too close an involvement with Alberta's oil and gas industry. So I think that's a move forward. The trick, of course, is we don't know if this will be the same government after the October election in Quebec. And the other thing here is they have some common cause on issues related to sovereignty and possibly at some point doing some change to the Canadian Constitution. So I'm sure that although there's a lot of concentration on economy, it goes hand in hand with that question about sovereignty and jurisdictional issues.
Chris, what do you take away from the Smith-Franchette meeting, especially coming off last week's Western Premiers Conference in Kananaskis, which was not exactly comfortable where Premier Smith is concerned?
Yep. I think the Premier is looking for friends, and so Quebec has some of the same ambitions that Alberta does, some elements of it. Interesting how the message has changed in a little more than a year when Premier was down in Mar-a-Lago, seemingly advancing Alberta interests for separation and independence, and now in Quebec saying that they have a lot in common with Quebec in terms of dealing with Ottawa, who's not prepared to listen to provincial concerns.
Kathy, we're looking there at images of pipe. How big of a win would it be for Danielle Smith if it is that Quebec comes to the table to actually collaborate on an east-west energy corridor?
I think it would be a big win for her from a lot of perspectives. Right now, as Chris says, I mean, she is trying to turn the needle on what the situation is here in Alberta vis-a-vis Team Canada. And that would be a real Team Canada move if we can get that pipe going east-west. It's one of those obvious things related to interprovincial trade that everybody goes, well, why isn't there one? So it would make a whole lot of sense to the average voter. Whether it makes sense economically or industrially is a different question. So I think it has a certain symbolic value that she would really love to have.
Chris, there was lots of talk in Quebec City about sovereignty and autonomy. So maybe to what degree do you see this visit being about Danielle Smith sending a message back home to the separatist movement?
Oh, that's entirely the purpose of this visit. She's not playing to a Quebec audience. She's playing to an Alberta audience. And again, trying to walk the fence in terms of claiming to support Canada, but also sending messages to Quebec, Alberta separatists, but that basically she hasn't abandoned them, and she's seeking to learn from what they've done in Quebec. So certainly the Premier continues to ride the fence and try to appease both sides.
Kathy, you mentioned an election a moment ago. Quebec voters, of course, going to the polls on October 5th, 2 weeks ahead of the Alberta referendum. There is a lot of people looking on. The Separatist Party Québécois may be in with a chance here. So how interesting a month could October end up being where debate over secession period is concerned?
Oh, I think it's going to be really interesting. I think that the result of the Quebec election is going to be pretty fascinating for all of Canada. I gather that there's been a slight bump up in the current government's polls since Frechette has taken over as premier, but they're still riding behind. The PQ have said yes, we want to go for a referendum. It's all really interesting. I mean, obviously, right now. Danielle Smith has to be dealing with the current government. She cannot be dealing with a PQ government in waiting for a lot of reasons. Part of them it relates to the referendum, her own referendum stand that would obviate the question of having a separatist referendum here. But if they win, if the PQ win in Quebec at the beginning of October, it'll be really interesting to see if she tries to use that as leverage in some way. I think it's going to be a hot time. It's going to be a very hot time for the federal government too on how they deal with both provinces at once in 1 month.
Yep, setting up for an interesting October. For us, time for a bit of a break. When we come back, Alberta's privacy watchdog weighing in on the voters list leak. More from our politics panel in a moment. Welcome back. Alberta's Information and Privacy Commissioner is renewing calls for heightened oversight in the wake of the voters list leak. In a release issued Wednesday, Diane McLeod calls the breach the worst in Canadian history involving voter data and says her office has for decades called for amendments to privacy legislation covering political parties. The commissioner says her office has received correspondence from more than 400 Albertans expressing safety fears after a version of the voters list was published by the separatist group, the Centurion Project. Chris, I'll start with you first this time. Is this an issue that has fallen off the radar of Albertans? What do you make of Diane McLeod coming out and making this statement now?
Well, I think that's very courageous of her, and she's made it very plain that this is a very serious issue. The Justice Minister, Mo Amery, has said that the government takes this issue very seriously. But on the other hand, no charges have been issued against the Centurion Project and David Parker, who's now hiding in Texas. So, there are the words of the government and the Justice Minister, and there's the actions, and the two don't appear to reconcile.
Kathy, surprised the Smith government has not started to move on calls for strengthening privacy laws governing political parties, even maybe as a means of showing more of a response to the data breach beyond leaving it in the hands of investigators, including the RCMP?
Yeah, I think that there's two things that are at play here. One of them is that they're using the argument that there's an RCMP investigation underway, and so they don't want to, say anything too much, but, they've expressed vague concern and all the rest of it without taking action. I don't see any particular reason why they can't take some action or make some definitive statement, even if the RCMP are still investigating. This is not before the courts, as Chris just mentioned. So, they have got some chance to take some action here and are not. And there's a couple of reasons here. One of them is that in the past, and this is, fair or not fair, in the past, we know that the Premier has been to some extent associated with some of those separatists, particularly David Parker, in terms of UCP involvement and in terms of her own personal friendships with David Parker. I think they would like this to fade into the background and not sully her now, Captain Canada type image. But also, I think that with the referendum coming up, they want to keep this under the waves, because if that whole question of that voter list becomes a big issue and people completely lose their heads about whether their information is safe, but also whether elections are safe, whether there's going to be interference, all of the other things that follow from that data breach, then it really does muddy the whole referendum waters. And right now, she's staking a lot on that referendum. The concept of citizen initiatives are an important part of the electoral process in Alberta. So they want to keep this under wraps.
Well, and Chris, in terms of it being on the radar, how much more of a focus do you expect there will be on the data breach as Albertans get closer to voting in the referendum, even confidence in the process?
Well, I don't think Albertans can have confidence in the process. We were very fortunate that the Privacy Commissioner made the statement that she did, because the government clearly would not have said anything unless she made that statement. And so now we have a reaction from the Justice Minister, but again, just a statement. And I don't expect any more comments on this issue from the current Alberta government. They do want it to fade into the background. They want the 2.9 million Albertans whose data was breached to simply forget about this by October.
All right. For us, one more topic, and that is our conversation off the top this evening with Dr. Braden Mans on the Alberta government setting a new patient-focused surgery funding model into motion. Kathy, as a policy shift, how do you see this move changing healthcare dynamics in Alberta?
I think this is a step even further down the road on privatization. We've already had the issue about doctors being able to perform surgeries in both private and public venues, and now we have this question of basically what is a voucher system. Take a look at how people talk about privatization of education. They talk about the voucher system, where basically students are the money follows the student, even if it goes to the private system. So this is a similar kind of concept, that patient focus. So I think the idea being here that they want to give a more and more of an impression that the public system is inefficient, the private system is more efficient. They're using this pilot, which only applies to the public system, perhaps, as an example of that, and say, okay, look, we tried this, and they're not doing any better than they were before. So clearly we need to expand this pilot into a permanent situation that includes the private system. And just as the doctor said, then you get into that bifurcation of easy cases versus more difficult cases. Private get the easy ones, public get the difficult.
Chris, do you see this new policy landing with Albertans with the same degree of concern that we're hearing from health professionals?
Well, I think Albertans should be aware that the funding was announced more than a year ago, and it's taken a year just to get the announcement to the announcement phase. The problem we have in Alberta is that our public health facilities are generally underutilized. But in the core areas, in the urban areas, the 12 cities that will now receive funding, we have waiting lists. So the underutilized rural facilities could be used, but won't be. The complex operations that need to take place, if you've been diagnosed with cancer, now it's going to be a trade-off. There's an incentive to do knee and hip surgeries ahead of complex cancer surgery. So if you've been diagnosed and they now tell you, oh, it's going to take 2 years before you can have your surgery, how are you going to feel about that? So the government's going to say these surgeries need to transfer to private chartered facilities, but in fact, they have the facilities available now, and they need to incentivize the use of existing surgical facilities and provide the same incentives to a broader range of hospitals.
All right, folks, we're out of time. We have to leave it there. Great to see you both. Thank you for this.
You're welcome. Thank you, Michael.
Now, here are a few responses to a recent story posted by CTV News about Alberta rolling out new ID cards in July. Mossy Roots starts us off with this: no thank you. I don't want my health information to be attached to my address. Pictor Music writes this: so when you are in a motor vehicle collision and you are sharing info with the other driver and they take a picture of your most secure form of ID, now they can see your healthcare number too. As soon as I am forced to get one of these cards, I am immediately placing a strip of tape over the healthcare number. Aiden's a fan saying, I hate replacing my health card, so I like this. Psychology of wellness questions the expenditure, so this is what the province chooses to spend its time and money on: not education, not healthcare, but ID cards. And according to Robert, it's a little premature since we will hopefully be leaving soon. Have your say. Email us anytime at comments@albertaprimetime.com. Coming up tomorrow, with First Nations leaders rallying communities to vote to stay in Canada, we'll hear from academic Matthew Wildcat on how that could motivate political strategy. That's coming up on Friday. Until then, have a great evening, everyone, from all of us at Alberta Primetime. Thank you for watching, and join us again next time.